While Prince Charles expressed strong doubts about genetically modified crops, for instance, his father commented that the introduction of the grey squirrel into Britain had probably done more damage than GM crops were ever likely to. What impressed everyone about the Prince was his genuine understanding of conservation issues. Robert Napier says he was far more than just a name on the letterhead of WWF.
He was no titular head of this organisation. He had, to some, a surprising amount of knowledge, and that's because he took a lot of trouble himself to read, to talk to people, and to gain a really deep understanding of the issues concerning conservation. Very impressive.
Robert Napier ending that report by Roger Harrowbin. Let's get another word with the BBC's Rob Watson. And Rob, I just wanted to ask you about the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, which some of our listeners may not know about. What was it, or what is it, and how important was it to the Duke of Edinburgh?
I think it was hugely important to him, and of course to the many thousands of people, in fact 7 million people over the years who took part in it. It was founded in 1956, and the idea of it was to give young people, not just in the UK, but actually around the Commonwealth, around the world, a sort of sense of responsibility to themselves and to their communities. One of my children actually started doing it, and it was the idea of combining some physical exercise, doing some volunteering, to sort of give younger people this sort of idea that they had a place in the world. And if you think about it, at the time when the scheme was set up in the 1950s, the era of the sort of the post-war rebellious teenager, the idea of mods and rockers, the idea of the teenagers as characters in their own right, in a funny sort of way, you might say. This was a rather old-fashioned idea, which again goes back to one of the overriding themes of the Duke's life, and that is the sense of duty. But clearly the Duke of Edinburgh War Scheme, undoubtedly one of his successes.
Yes, and we're going to be hearing more about it in a few minutes' time. And I guess it also fits in. I mean, he was he loved sport, physical exercise, the outdoors. That was very important, wasn't it?
Hugely important. I mean, you could say in many ways he was the, how would you put this? He was the sort of epitome of his generation, of his class, of his background. I mean, he was immensely athletic, as we discussed a bit earlier, James. He was a incredibly dashing figure as a young man, with that sort of snow blonde hair, a very athletic physique. He loved cricket. He loved being on horseback, and all of these things he wouldn't have given much thought to, and I think that's one of the things I keep coming back to today when one is thinking about Prince Philip, and that is this sort of day where people are doing lots of analysing. What kind of a chap was he? What kind of a man was he? And this is something I suspect that he would either have found immensely amusing or rather irritating, because he was from a sort of pre-psychoanalyzing day. If you'd asked him, what kind of a man are you? What kind of life have you lived? I think he'd look at you as if you were mad. And it brings to mind, one of those interviews that has really stuck out for me, James. There's an interviewer asks him, puts to him his sort of background. You went into exile at age 21. Your parents divorced. You lost a sister in an aircraft crash. You were essentially sent off to boarding school, sort of fatherless in some ways, motherless. You ended up having to become the consort to the Queen in a much earlier life than you would. I mean, how on earth have you put up with this? And there was a sort of pause, and Prince Philip looked at the interviewer and said, "You just get on with it." And I think that really sort of sums up his approach to life. This idea of something you just get on with, and also this sort of sense of duty. It's a rather kind of old-fashioned concept to all of us now. This idea that there are some things that you just have to do whether you want to or not. Whereas we, of course, tend to live in an age where people are governed more by doing what they feel would be right or would make them feel happy.
Rob, thank you. We're going to head to Australia now. We're going to head to Sydney and talk to the BBC's Shaima Khalil for some reaction there. And Shaima, what's been the official reaction, first of all?
Well, we heard first from the Governor-General. It is protocol that we hear from the Governor-General, him being the Queen's representative here in Australia, but the Prime Minister's, Scott Morrison's statement came through very shortly after that, and in his statement he said, for nearly 80 years Prince Philip served his crown, his country, the Commonwealth. His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh was, in the words of Her Majesty, her strength and stay. He embodied a generation that we will never see again. And then he went on to say that Prince Philip was no stranger to Australia, having visited the country on more than 20 occasions, and through his service to the Commonwealth he presided as patron for 50 organisations. And then he mentioned what you and Rob were talking about, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which encouraged over 775,000 young Australians to explore their leadership potential, and currently 40,000 young Australians are on the program. He also says that further details about Australia's remembrance of Prince Philip will be announced over the coming days. Of course, he was knighted in 2015, quite controversially, but really as a figure, he is very, very well admired here. He's always been very well received. He's had a long and enduring relationship with Australia, spanning 7 decades. He came here actually in 1940, not on a royal visit. Military service brought him here on board a Royal Navy destroyer. But of course, it was in 1954 that he made his royal visit, his first royal visit alongside Queen Elizabeth II, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II, in a remarkable visit, the first visit of a reigning monarch to visit Australia. It's interesting hearing what you and Rob were talking about in terms of his character, what kind of man he was, and his mannerisms. And this is something that really strikes a chord with so many Australians. In his last visit, which was 2011, he was received by Julia Gillard, the then Prime Minister, and in her remarks back then, she said, she described him as, quote, a true friend of this country in peace and war, an outstanding supporter of science, innovation, and the education of young people, a man whose robust humor and common sense have always resonated with the Australian character. And I think that last remark really captures a great deal, and again goes back to what we keep hearing about the Duke of Edinburgh. Of course, the royal visits themselves and the appearances across the country alongside the Queen and solo, they've been very coveted, very well received, very warmly welcomed. But it's Prince Philip's character, his straightforwardness, you know, his lack of political correctness at times, if you will, his humor that sometimes gets him in trouble. That's really left a big mark here in Australia, not just among the politicians that he met, and he's met many during the decades, but also the members of public who met him too.
Very interesting. I was wondering whether his sort of forthrightness would appeal to Australians, and it sounds like it always has. Shaima, thank you very much indeed. Shaima Khalil joining us live from Sydney in Australia. A reminder that you're listening to a programme marking the death of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, which was announced a little earlier by Buckingham Palace. We're hearing some of the tributes and remembering his life. But perhaps now let's just hear a bit more from the man himself. And one of the subjects is the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme that we've been talking about. But let's hear this bit of an interview that the BBC's John Humphreys did with the Duke of Edinburgh. This was back in 1991, so 30 years ago. And he began by recalling how the scheme came into being.
Well, the idea really was to sort of complement the ordinary academic education. The idea was to encourage people to take part in those sort of things which adults eventually find worthwhile doing outside their work, a hobby, a sport, an expedition, some voluntary service. That was really the point. And the idea was to give them the experience by exposing them to the possibilities, to give them the experience so that they eventually could choose, you know, from their experience what to do later on in life.
Was it a challenge? Was it intended to be a challenge?
I think it was a sort of do-it-yourself growing up kit. It was an extension of, as I say, of the education system. It is in fact achievable by most people, in fact by practically everybody, because the thing is adjusted to the capability of the individual. So challenge in a sense, but not entirely, no.
But I wonder perhaps whether it came from the sort of Kurt Hahn philosophy, whether it was all about self-reliance, about personal achievement.
Yes, it had a lot to do with Hahn, in the sense that he stimulated the whole idea, but I think it then got developed by the group that eventually put the scheme together as it stands today.
But you regard Kurt Hahn in a sense as the sort of...
Oh yes, he was the inspirer of it, by all means, but in the same way that he was the inspirer of Outward Bound, the inspirer of what's now become the United World Colleges. It was his basic idea, but I think that he was very much an ideas man. I mean, he had a philosophy about the young, but I think that it needed an intermediary of some sort who would convert what was a good idea into a kind of practical scheme.
A difficult question in the space of the amount of time we have, but how would you encapsulate the Hahn philosophy?
Well, I think it was that he felt that the education of the young should go beyond purely academic education, that they needed to have their horizons extended. They needed to be made to feel responsible and self-reliant, I suppose, as you were saying.
Is the philosophy behind it rewarding somebody for having done something, or trying to inspire somebody to do something?
I suppose in the end it's to encourage them to do something and to give them some recognition for having done it. Yes.
Some people have been critical of the scheme because they would say, you talk about encouraging people to do things, they would say that those people who do the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme are the sort of people probably who would do it without any encouragement anyway.
Well, I don't think that's quite true, because I suppose you could say that about almost anything. It depends very much on the adults concerned. If I don't think young people will flock to a scheme of this kind on their own necessarily. A lot of them do. A lot of them started up entirely independently, and they just go along to an open award centre and they say, I'd like to start it. But the majority require, in a sense, the encouragement of some adult who's associated with them in some way, just to get them started and to explain to them what it's all about and what they have to do. And where there are these I think, remarkable individual adults, they get a tremendous response. But it is the adult that will encourage the young to take part.
Are you concerned at all that it's seen by some people as a bit of a middle-class thing?
Depends on your perception. I mean, I think if you want to say it's a middle-class thing, I mean, you're going to say it. There are a great many open award centres that take people from every section of life in every part of the country, in both rural and city and urban. I think there's inevitably there is, in the way the whole of our social pattern is structured, is that there's always the middle bit that gets most attention, or where the relationship between adult and young, where there are the least problems, where the two cooperate. It's at one extreme where the difficulty arises, where there's an alienation and things like that. So then you have to work very much harder to get them in, but they come in.
Do you detect that young people, and I know this is a terrible generalization that I'm asking you either to agree with or disagree with, that young people are more or less alienated now, to use the word that you used earlier, and if so, does it worry you at all?
I think if you had asked Pericles or something, he would have given you exactly the same answer about young people as anybody does today. I mean, people go through a state of mind while they're growing up, which in some cases alienates them, in other cases it inspires them, in other cases it turns them off, in some cases it turns them on. I think every older generation is going to be critical of the younger generation at some stage. I mean, simply because you're older, that's all, and you look at things differently. But I think, broadly speaking, young people have been young people ever since young people have been young people.
The Duke of Edinburgh talking there to the BBC's John Humphreys back in 1991. Still with me, the BBC's Rob Watson. And Rob, just listening to that, one wonders why he did so few interviews, because he responds rather well. And whether you agree with him or not, he is very thoughtful, isn't he?
Absolutely. I've got to say, I entirely agree with you. He's a fantastic interviewee, much better than most politicians, partly because although he comes over as being rather prickly, which he undoubtedly was, he's sort of forthright and not in the least bit diplomatic or defensive. You ask him something and he definitely gives you the answer.
Yes, I mean, the caricature has always been that he would occasionally put his foot in it. I mean, I only heard him talk once, give a lecture, and he was very fluent, very articulate, very passionate. This was about education, but he didn't like publicity, or rather he didn't see it as his role to appear in public too much. I mean, not with the public, but on things like TV and radio.
That is right. I think he once famously described the media as being like Gibraltar apes, which one of his sort of classic little expressions. Not sure whether he said that exactly. I think actually, he understood the need to have that sort of balance between mystique. There still needs to be a certain amount of mystique about the royal family, including him, but also being accessible, and he understood the importance of public relations. Was he personally comfortable giving interviews? I think he just genuinely didn't like talking about himself. I mean, he was from that era where, questions about happiness, what do you feel about this, that and the other, that just wasn't for him.
Rob, thank you very much. Let's hear from the Queen now. And this is a short clip from a speech to mark their golden wedding anniversary. That was in 1997. And here is the Queen praising her husband.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand. And as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Queen Elizabeth. And just to recap that statement from Buckingham Palace a little earlier, it is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service.
From the beginning of the story as a headline, BBC News, to taking a more in-depth look as things develop.
That is a potential real implication, isn't it?
Yeah, this is incredibly worrisome.
And how events affect lives.
My country is in turmoil.
We're reporting from all around the world and telling the stories of the people at the heart of the headlines.
The BBC World Service. This is the BBC World Service. Today we're making changes to our schedule following the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Now we return to NewsHour with James Menendez. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is the BBC World Service. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth. He was 99 years old. A statement from the palace said, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course," the statement continues. The royal family joined with people around the world in mourning his loss. Well, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke to the nation from Downing Street a little earlier and said the Duke had helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life. He said the Duke had earned the affection of generations in the UK, across the Commonwealth and around the world. You're listening to the BBC in London. Let's get the news now in detail.
I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, at the age of 99. He was the longest-serving consort in British history. He was married to Queen Elizabeth for more than 70 years. The Duke dedicated most of his life to royal duty, serving the nation at the monarch's side. In a statement, the palace said it is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. The Union flag at Buckingham Palace has been lowered to half-mast. The Duke had returned to Windsor Castle 3 weeks ago after spending a month in hospital. He initially received care for an infection, but then underwent heart surgery for a pre-existing condition. He was 2 months away from his 100th birthday. Prince Philip was born into the Greek monarchy shortly before a coup that led to his family being forced into exile. Rob Watson looks back at his early life.
Born on the island of Corfu, Prince Philip was still a baby when his father was banished from Greece. He left in a makeshift crib on a British warship sent to rescue the family. After schooling in Britain, and also for a time in Germany, Philip joined the Royal Navy. During the Second World War, he saw action when the Italian fleet was trapped in the Mediterranean in 1941, manning a searchlight on HMS Valiant to pick out enemy ships. It was during the war years that his romance with the future monarch developed. When Elizabeth became queen, she granted her husband precedence over all other members of the royal family.
Prince Philip's role as consort was to support the Queen. In a speech to mark their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, the Queen praised her husband.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has led tributes to the Duke.
It is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today, because they have lost not just a much-loved and highly respected public figure, but a devoted husband and a proud and loving father, grandfather, and, in recent years, great-grandfather.
The opposition Labour leader Keir Starmer also paid tribute.
The UK has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. He dedicated his life to our country, and above all, I think he'll be remembered for his support and devotion to the Queen.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said she was saddened by the news. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Leaders around the world have sent their condolences. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi praised Prince Philip for his distinguished career in the military and for his community service. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau described the Duke of Edinburgh as a man of great purpose and conviction. The Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said he had embodied a generation that would never be seen again. The former US President George W. Bush said he had lived a long and remarkable life, devoting himself to worthy causes and to other people. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the Duke as a consummate public servant. Our Europe regional editor Danny Eberhardt reports on reaction to the death of Prince Philip across the continent.
The Dutch royal family were among those to praise Prince Philip for his life of service to the British people. In a statement, King Willem-Alexander also spoke with affection of his lively personality. Sweden's King, Carl XVI Gustaf, spoke of his great friendship with a man he'd known since his teenage years. Politicians across the continent have also spoken of their sadness. The Prime Minister of Malta, where Prince Philip was based during his time with the Royal Navy in the post-war years, said his compatriots would treasure his memory.
Prince Philip took a keen interest in science and technology and in business and sport, but he'll be particularly remembered for his commitment to nature conservation and his work with the WWF, known originally as the World Wildlife Fund. Correspondents say he was ahead of his time in grasping the threat humans pose to endangered species and the natural world. He used his position to win an audience for the cause of conservation. However, he was one of the few environmental campaigners who could claim many decades ago to have shot a tiger, and he continued all his life to defend controlled hunting. That's the latest BBC News.
It's 14:06 GMT. You're listening to the BBC World Service with me, James Menendez, and a programme to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, which was announced a little earlier by Buckingham Palace. He was 99 years old. Now, this is the statement that we received just after noon UK time. It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course, continues the statement. The royal family join with people around the world in mourning his loss. Well, over the coming hours here on the BBC, we shall be paying tribute to the Duke. We're going to be looking back at his lifetime of service to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, at his role as consort to Queen Elizabeth, and of course hearing reaction from around the world. But let's start by talking to the BBC's Naomi Grimley, who'll be with us throughout the hour. And Naomi, first of all, that lifetime of service, staggering 70 years nearly as the Queen's consort.
That's right, and ever since that wedding in 1947, he's been a fixture in British life and a huge character to boot, well known for having his forthright views, but also a man of great and varied interests, whether it was religion or the environment or industry, or even things like population growth. Those were the kind of issues he liked to engage with, and yet he also had this huge balancing trick of having to stay in the shadow of Her Majesty and also carry out all those public duties that are expected of a senior royal.
Did he feel comfortable with his role? I mean, it was almost up to him to create his own job, wasn't it?
Indeed. In fact, when he first became a prince, he's supposed to have read a biography of Prince Albert to try and learn some lessons, if you like, about how to be a consort to a queen. But he ended up throwing the book away in the end in frustration because he realised that modern monarchy required a different set of skills. So, yes, on the one hand, he was very much in her shadow. He had to stay a few steps behind her at public engagements. But on the other hand, he was actually urging her and the institution of the monarchy to modernise. So things, for example, like fly-on-the-wall documentaries of the royals, those kind of things in the 1960s, he was actually at the forefront of those decisions.
Did he enjoy his role? I mean, he was, the number of public engagements he carried out, even right until he was into his 90s, is extraordinary, isn't it?
Indeed. I mean, even in his 80th year, he conducted 550 odd engagements, and also over his lifetime, he was patron of about 800 different charities. So there were times, of course, when his frustration shone through. He might say slightly off-the-cuff remarks at things, but nevertheless, you know, as he put it when he came to retire a few years ago from public life, I've done my bit, and he really did, you know, show that sense of duty, which is why it is such a big deal in Britain today that he's died.
Naomi, for the moment, thank you very much. Well, let's get some reaction now. First of all, from Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who spoke outside number 10 Downing Street shortly after his death was announced by Buckingham Palace. This is what he had to say.
It was with great sadness that a short time ago I received word from Buckingham Palace that His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh has passed away at the age of 99. Prince Philip earned the affection of generations here in the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth and around the world. He was the longest serving consort in history, one of the last surviving people in this country to have served in the Second World War. At Cape Matapan, where he was mentioned in dispatches for bravery, and in the invasion of Sicily, where he saved his ship by his quick thinking. And from that conflict, he took an ethic of service that he applied throughout the unprecedented changes of the post-war era. Like the expert carriage driver that he was, he helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life. He was an environmentalist and a champion of the natural world long before it was fashionable. With his Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, he shaped and inspired the lives of countless young people, and at literally tens of thousands of events, he fostered their hopes and encouraged their ambitions. We remember the Duke for all of this, and above all, for his steadfast support for Her Majesty the Queen. Not just as her consort, by her side every day of her reign, but as her husband, her strength and stay of more than 70 years. And it is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today, because they have lost not just a much-loved and highly respected public figure, but a devoted husband, and a proud and loving father, grandfather, and in recent years, great-grandfather. Speaking on their golden wedding anniversary, Her Majesty said that our country owed her husband a greater debt than he would ever claim or we shall ever know. And I'm sure that estimate is correct. So we mourn today with Her Majesty the Queen. We offer our condolences to her and to all her family. And we give thanks as a nation and a kingdom for the extraordinary life and work of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking outside number 10 Downing Street a couple of hours ago. Let me just read you some reaction from leaders of Commonwealth countries to news of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. This from Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who says Prince Philip was a man of great purpose and conviction who was motivated by a sense of duty to others. He'll be fondly remembered as a constant in the life of our Queen, a lifelong companion who was always at her side, offering unfailing support as she carried out her duties. This from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. My thoughts are with the British people and the royal family on the passing away of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. He had a distinguished career in the military and was at the forefront of many community service initiatives. May his soul rest in peace. Well, let's just take a look at the Duke's life now, and in particular that role as consort, that support Prince Philip gave to Queen Elizabeth as she carried out her royal duties. Her Majesty once described him as her strength and stay. It's our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell.
For decade after decade, no one was closer to the British monarchy, no one mattered more to the British monarch than Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His was the support that mattered most to his wife, the Queen. Famously forthright in his views, he was once asked to sum up his contribution.
I've just done what I think is my best. I mean, some people think it was all right, other people quite often said don't. What can you do? I can't suddenly change my whole way of doing things. I can't change my interests. I can't change my way in which I react to things. It's part of somebody's style. It's too bad.
Philip was born on the Greek island of Corfu in June 1921. The family was banished, and after his parents split up, he was cared for by relatives and went to the Scottish boarding school Gordonston. During the Second World War, he served in the Royal Navy. He was mentioned in dispatches. His first significant meeting with Princess Elizabeth was in 1939. They married 8 years later.
And as the wedding march peals out gaily through the Abbey,
the early years of married life were blissful. Philip's naval career flourished, but in February 1952, Elizabeth's father, King George VI, died. She was now Queen. At that moment, a friend of Philip's said he looked as if half the world had dropped on him. He was the consort to a crowned monarch, but he had no constitutional role himself, and his promising military career had been cut short. Philip didn't find it easy at first. He focused his considerable energies on issues like the environment and conservation. His most lasting contribution could well be his Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which offered challenges and adventures to tens of thousands of young people. He became their champion.
When a group of young people like bin shrinkers appear, everybody's, oh my God, the young people are terrible, they all become bin shrinkers. Well, they haven't. It's that one group who were mods and rockers a few generations. You probably one yourself. I mean, people go through well, you never know. People become quite civilized when they grow up.
Because I know you hate the L word, but do you see it as an important part of your legacy?
Legacy? No, I don't. It's got nothing to do with me. It's there for people to use. I couldn't care less.
And you would obviously argue it's still relevant.
Well, a school's relevant, isn't it?
And your scheme?
It's relevant too, because it's part of the process of growing up.
Philip's tendency to be direct sometimes caused offence. His critics accused him of being tactless and prone to gaffes. The most notorious of these occurred during a visit to China with the Queen in 1986. He told British students there, if you stay here much longer, you'll all be slitty-eyed. During the most difficult week of the Queen's reign, after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, Philip was with his wife when she returned to London after being criticised for being cold and out of touch. And he walked with his grandsons William and Harry behind the coffin of their mother. In June 2011, he marked his 90th birthday with a typically frank admission of the reality of advancing age. He told the BBC he was reducing his workload because it was better to get out before, as he put it, you reach your sell-by date.
I reckon I've done my bit. I want to enjoy myself now, with less responsibility, less frantic rushing about, less preparation, less trying to think of something to say. Top of that, memories going, I can't remember names and things. Yeah, so I'm just sort of winding down.
It took him almost 6 years to act on his own advice. His final solo engagement, at the age of 96, was to attend a parade by the Royal Marines on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. He left with a jaunty wave. His life after that was much quieter, spent mostly at the Queen's estate at Sandringham. It was there in January 2019, while he was driving himself from the estate, that he survived a serious road accident. His vehicle overturned, he was badly shaken, and he surrendered his driving licence shortly afterwards. By now, he was rarely seen in public. Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was the longest-serving royal consort in British history. His support to his wife, the Queen, in public, and more importantly, in private, was the essential foundation which underpinned the success of her long reign. In a speech marking their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, the Queen paid her husband this tribute.
He has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Queen Elizabeth sending that report by the BBC's royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell. We're going to head to India now. We'll talk to Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's the BBC's South Asia correspondent. And Rajini, Prince Philip knew the region, knew South Asia well, didn't he?
He did indeed. I mean, even before he married Her Majesty the Queen, he had deep connections to the region. We heard in that obituary that you played just then from my colleague Nicholas Witchell about his career in the Royal Navy, and actually he was stationed in the region for some time during the Second World War. He was stationed in Sri Lanka, known back then as Ceylon, and actually I was looking on social media this afternoon. There were photos of the car that he used to drive in Colombo that were posted. The car was being displayed at a hotel in Colombo. So a lot of memories of him in Sri Lanka at the time, but also he had a personal family connection as well. His uncle was Lord Mountbatten, who was the last Viceroy of India and the first Governor General of an independent India. And of course, as well as that, he visited India on a number of occasions. His first trip was in 1959, where he was received by Prime Minister Nehru, but he also visited on a number of occasions with Her Majesty the Queen. In 1961, for example, he was the guest with Her Majesty at the Republic Day parade that happens every January. And I've been looking back, James, at some of the Pathé newsreels from that time. Incredible pictures of their visits. They also visited in 1983. They were hosted by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi then, and in 1997 with the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of India's independence.
And what's been the official reaction? Has the government spoken?
Well, you read out the tweet from Prime Minister Modi not too long ago on the programme. I'll just repeat some of the main things that came from that. Prime Minister Modi said that his thoughts were with the British people and the royal family. He said that Prince Philip had had a distinguished career in the military and was at the forefront of many community service initiatives. And I was struck just then listening to people talking in that obituary as well about the Duke of Edinburgh Award, which was actually, just talking to some Indians here, a very big thing, maybe 20, 30 years ago in schools in India. And actually somebody was telling me just how they received very personally in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now known, a Duke of Edinburgh medal from Prince Philip, who happened to be visiting the city at the time. And she said she'll always remember that as one of the highlights of her school days. There's lots of other stories and anecdotes that are coming out about his connections to this region. Another one that struck me is that Prince Philip, of course, was a big polo player, and polo is big in India. It was founded here, or started here, and he had very good ties with the royal family in Jaipur. And there's a story that I was reading earlier, James, of just how he was such a big fan of Alfonso mangoes, which of course are in season at the moment here in India. And so the royal family in Jaipur would send a box of Alfonso mangoes to Prince Philip on his birthday every year. So, you know, I mean, it's just nice to hear all of these personal anecdotes, and of course, very close ties between the two countries, former, you know, colony, etc. But just nice to hear some of those personal ties as well.
Yes, indeed. I wonder how they managed to get the mangoes to arrive in perfect condition. As we know, it's very important to eat them in exactly the right condition. Rajini, thank you very much indeed. Rajini Vaidyanathan, the BBC's South Asia correspondent, still with us, the BBC's Naomi Grimley. And just thinking about that overseas work that the royal family does, and the Duke of Edinburgh did, I mean, the figures, Naomi, are staggering. Even when he was just on his own, I think he did more than 600 overseas visits, and he went to, what, 60, 70 countries?
That's right. He was a man of extreme energy when it came to travels. And remember, of course, he had begun his adult life in the Royal Navy, so he also was well travelled from his period of service, which saw him in the Mediterranean during the Second World War, and even seeing the Japanese surrender at the end of the war. So he was a very well-travelled man, although of course there were times when he offended people. For example, he once described the Hungarians as pot-bellied. He also, of course, famously offended the Chinese by describing them as slitty-eyed. And yet, in a way, it was these kind of forthright remarks, these off-the-cuff remarks, which often sort of endeared him to the British press.
Yes, I was just reading one quote that someone was talking about. I think he was in Canada, and he said, "I open this thing, whatever it is," and just left it at that. I mean, I guess he had so many different engagements, but I mean, did he see it as a crucial part of the royal family's role, particularly when it came to the Commonwealth?
Yes, it was part of their public image and the Queen's connection and commitment to the Commonwealth, that they had to travel around the world and be seen to be in these different countries all the time, sort of showing the links, the historical links, particularly, of course, in that period of decolonisation, so that period where countries were trying to break away from the formality of the British Empire and forge their own identities. And as we've heard, he didn't always strike the tone the right way, you know, but at other times he was good at sort of picking up on global issues such as climate change and conservation, and putting those at the forefront of the royal mission when it came to maintaining links with the Commonwealth.
Naomi, thank you. Yes, people have spoken of his ability to talk to people from all walks of life. We're going to head down the road from BBC headquarters to Buckingham Palace now. We can talk to the BBC's Sarah Campbell, who's outside. And Sarah, just give us a flavour of what's happening there.
Well, it's a beautiful sunny day here, and the Robin News was announced. There has been a steady stream of people coming past Buckingham Palace. There's quite a collection of flowers against the gates. This, of course, Buckingham Palace, the London home of the royal family, and possibly globally is the building most associated with the royal family. Of course, we've seen it how many times did we see him waving from the balcony there at sort of various big national events and global events. So it's understandable that he wants to come down here. Reading some of the messages, there's a sense of thank you, I think, that I read. To Trudeau, thank you for devoted service to our country. Another one, to life, thank you for your service to our country. So a real recognition here that Prince Philip over the years just gave so much in terms of duty. I mean, that was his sort of middle name, and he continued for the 73 years that he was married to the Queen. There was an announcement. Well, it's traditional for sort of big royal events that an announcement is placed on the gates of Buckingham Palace, and it was placed on the gates. Normally it would have been left for around 24 hours, but it was taken down within the hour, and that is because of course there is a pandemic ongoing, and I think there's a real concern, or there's a real hope that people can mourn Prince Philip, and people will want to mourn Prince Philip, but they're hoping that any events that might draw crowds are to be discouraged. So that's why, although people are stopping laying flowers, they are being moved on quite quickly. But as I say, definitely a sense from people that they wanted to come down to Buckingham Palace. They wanted to give their thanks. I asked one 15-year-old, because of course Prince Philip retired in 2017, so he hasn't been in the public eye, so youngsters won't necessarily know much about him. And I asked her what Prince Philip had meant to her, and she said, well, she'd come down mainly for her nan, who'd phoned her when she'd heard the news and was in tears, and that's why she wanted to come to Buckingham Palace. So over the years, Prince Philip has meant a lot to many, many people of different generations, and I think we're seeing that reflected in the messages and the people who've come here today.
Yes, this extraordinary connection with the past, I guess.
I mean, absolutely. Born in 1921, saw active service in the Second World War, mentioned in dispatches, and has been a figurehead, probably the most famous family on the planet for 73 years. And so, people will have recollections of him. I've heard him described as sort of part of the furniture of British life, and I think that's what it is. The Queen and Prince Philip have just been present at all those big events, whether it's the state opening of Parliament, whether it's garden parties, and I think he will be sorely missed.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. That was the BBC's Sarah Campbell joining us live from outside Buckingham Palace. You're listening to a programme marking the death of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. This is the BBC.
This is the BBC World Service.
From the beginning of the story as a headline,
a new respiratory virus first identified in Wuhan has spread to other cities,
to taking a more in-depth look as things develop.
We're following a vaccine trial at one of the UK's 5 clinical trial centres.
And how events affect lives.
From my home in Brooklyn, I heard sirens all day, all night. For the rest of our lives, that's what we will remember.
We're reporting from all around the world.
Let's cross to Istanbul.
Let's get more from Hong Kong.
Welcome to Delhi from our correspondent in Sydney.
The latest from Johannesburg.
And telling the stories of the people at the heart of the headlines.
Protesters have marched through several cities in Belarus in defiance of a harsh clampdown by the security forces.
Every time we go out, we're really afraid.
Who is around you? Who is following you?
My country is in turmoil.
The BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is the BBC World Service in London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth. He was 99 years old. A statement from the palace said he passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Here on the BBC, we'll continue to reflect on his life and his passions, including his time in the Royal Navy, and we'll continue to get reaction from around the world. First, though, a summary of the news.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. Buckingham Palace has announced that the Duke of Edinburgh has died. In a statement, the palace said it is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. The royal family joined with people around the world in mourning his loss. Prince Philip was 99 and the longest-serving consort in British history. The Duke and Queen Elizabeth were married for more than 70 years. Prince Philip dedicated decades of his life to royal duty, serving the nation at the monarch's side. He was seen as a strong-willed and independent man. Interviewed on his 70th birthday, he had this to say.
I've just done what I think is my best. I mean, some people think it was all right, other people quite evidently don't. What can you do? I can't suddenly change my whole way of doing things. I can't change my interests. I can't change the way in which I react to things. That's part of That's somebody's style.
The Prince returned to Windsor Castle in mid-March after spending a month in hospital where he had an operation for a heart condition. People have been laying flowers outside the castle's gates. Speaking from his residence in Downing Street, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Prince Philip had earned the affection of generations around the world and that it inspired the lives of countless young people with his Duke of Edinburgh award scheme. Other world leaders have been paying tribute to the Duke. The former US President George W. Bush said he had lived a long and remarkable life. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi praised Prince Philip for his distinguished career in the military and for his community service. And the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau described him as a man of great purpose and conviction. And that's the latest BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service with me, James Menendez, and a programme to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, which has been announced by Buckingham Palace. He was 99 years old. Tributes have been pouring in from around the world, and here in Britain, the leader of the opposition, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, had this tribute.
Well, the UK has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. He dedicated his life to our country, and above all, I think he'll be remembered for his support and devotion to the Queen. And all of our thoughts with the Queen, the royal family, and the British public as they come together to mourn this huge loss.
And the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has also been paying her tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh.
I'm deeply saddened by the news that the Duke of Edinburgh has died, and my deepest personal condolences go to Her Majesty the Queen and the entire royal family. First and foremost, he was a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and my thoughts are with all of those today who will be feeling a profound sense of loss and grief. In particular, the Queen. He was her husband of 74 years, and I think we can all imagine just how devastated she will be at his loss. Prince Philip, though, he lived a life of public service and deep devotion to the Queen. He had a close association, of course, with Scotland. He went to school in Scotland. I know that he enjoyed all of the time he spent at Balmoral. He had a very long association as Chancellor with the University of Edinburgh. But probably above all of that, the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme transformed the lives and gave hope and inspiration to countless numbers of young people. So I think we should deeply appreciate the massive contribution that he made to public life and to the whole country.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. And the former British Prime Minister Theresa May has been speaking to the BBC about her memories of Prince Philip.
Well, of course, when we went to Balmoral, Prince Philip was there with Her Majesty and often other members of the family. And I also met him on occasions, on other occasions, locally and nationally. I mean, he was a man, when you spoke to Prince Philip, he was a man of so many different interests. He was an engineer, an inventor, a sportsman. He loved cricket. And I remember one occasion particularly when at a local event I was sitting next to him, and this was a few years ago, and the subject he spoke to me about was climate change. He didn't just have a concern about climate change, he knew what he was talking about, he knew his stuff, and he had so many interests, and he did so much for many. I think, as we will know, locally and internationally, he had a particular interest in encouraging the futures and in spreading the horizons of young people. There are millions of young people, millions of people around the world whose horizons were stretched, whose talents were developed, who were inspired by what they did in the Duke of Edinburgh's award. And that is tremendous legacy that he leaves.
Britain's former Prime Minister Theresa May speaking to the BBC a short time ago. Let's hear now from royal commentator Jenny Bond, who was also a former BBC royal correspondent. She covered the royal family for about 30 years and travelled the world with Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. She's been telling me about Prince Philip's personality.
A feisty man, an interesting character. I remember that someone within the palace once said, well, you know, Prince Philip was quite a handful, really, in many ways, a moderniser and a man who wanted his own way, but how boring it would have been if the Queen had married someone she might have been expected to marry, a rather tedious aristocrat of some form or another.
Interested you used that word moderniser. What did you mean?
When he arrived at Buckingham Palace as the Queen's husband without really a role, he had to find a role, and the first thing he did was set about trying to modernise the way the court worked. He found it stuffy, old-fashioned. The courtiers seemed to put obstacles in the way of everything he wanted to do to make things work better, more efficiently. Prince Philip was a very scientific man. He was deeply interested in design and efficiency. He went round every room in the palace when they took up residence there and opened the doors and said, well, who are you and what do you do here and how can I make it better? The courtiers at the time didn't like things being changed. Change was not a word that agreed with them at all. This modernising young upstart was not well received in the palace, and it took him quite a while to establish a role which he made absolutely his own, with his own interests, from the environment and science and design to the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, which is still going absolutely strong, and carve out a role for himself, because there simply really wasn't one.
What about his role in steering the royal family through some turbulent times? I mean, there have been many of them. Did he do much of that, or did he leave that to Queen Elizabeth?
What we should recognise, although he had to, if you like, be slightly subservient to the Queen in public, walk a couple of paces behind her, the Queen always came first. At home, the Queen made it absolutely clear that he was head.